and this has been the most difficult one yet. Okay, so let's move on then. What am I going to do today? So this presentation is broadly about violence against homeless persons or anti-homeless violence. What we're going to look at is two major things. So how do unhoused people experience and avoid anti-homeless violent victimization, right? So what are their experiences with it? And is there anything they do to try and stay safe or prevent themselves from being victimized on the streets? And then the second thing we're going to look at is, can our existing hate crime approaches and our laws adequately address or try to fix violence against our unhoused community members? And to do this, I'm going to be drawing from a case study looking at unhoused individuals' experiences from Lethbridge, Alberta. So quite close to some of you. This is just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about, quickly go over facts on homelessness in Canada. Then I'm going to go over just a little bit of the existing research to situate the work. Then I'm going to fly into the case study, describing our methodology and then some of our findings. So what Indigenous unhoused community members, as well as non-Indigenous unhoused community members shared with us. And then we're going to talk about some of the implications. What does this mean? And what do we do with this going forward? So the true prevalence of homelessness in Canada is unknown. It is very difficult for us to measure or count homelessness because, as you can imagine, those who are unhoused are often difficult to access. That being said, it's estimated that about 3% of Canadians at some point in their lives experience unsheltered homelessness. Now, what unsheltered homelessness refers to is people who essentially have no shelter in that moment. So these are the people sleeping in our parks, in our river valleys, outside, in alleys, and these are also individuals accessing our emergency shelter systems. In addition to this proportion, we also have about 15% of Canadians with experiences of hidden homelessness. This form of homelessness is called hidden homelessness because it's much harder to see. This is when someone, for example, loses their housing temporarily and has to stay with friends or family or couch surf. So together, we're looking at about 18%, which is quite a notable proportion. Now, of course, not everyone is at equal risk of homelessness, right? We know that some of us come from different communities and have various characteristics that makes such challenges much more likely. So groups that are disproportionately affected by homelessness, of course, Indigenous persons in Canada, women. Interestingly, women are one of the fastest growing groups of people experiencing homelessness in Canada today. Youth, much more likely, and sexual minorities, so members of the LGBTQ2+ community, much more likely to face homelessness. And then the same is true for recent immigrants. Now, while we, of course, know that unhoused community members are much more likely to be victimized, right? I think it's easy for us to understand they're on the streets, they don't have a safe place to go to hide from victimization, et cetera, et cetera. We know very little about their experiences with hate crime victimization. So we know they're likely to be harmed outside on the streets and shelters, but we know very little about how does this play out when it comes to hate crime. So very quick, just background of the existing literature. There is quite a big body of work looking at hate crime, right? And I'm sure many of us recognize hate crime as, anything that's motivated by hate, bias, animosity towards a particular characteristic. So this can be race, this can be sexual orientation, this can be religion. And we've been studying hate crime for a really long time, which is important because hate crime is hugely problematic. That being said, when we do talk about hate crime to date, people have not really talked about class. And here I mean, the extent to whether someone is rich or whether they're poor, whether they have a house or whether they don't. So scholars have really ignored class or the amount of money and resources one has in terms of looking at victimization through hate crime. This is interesting because there's a small but quickly growing body of work saying that unhoused community members are especially vulnerable to hate crime victimization precisely because they are homeless. In addition, we know very little about how hate crime impacts entire communities. So a lot of the studies have been very macro, right, from the top down. They haven't been from the streets up. And so the tangible effects on neighborhoods, really, we don't know much about. And that's a problem, right? Because hate crime, like other types of victimization, are 100% affected by these local community dynamics, the local context. So if I was to experience hate crime in Edmonton, where I am right now, it might be very different than my experience in Lethbridge or in Calgary or in Maskwacis. So to do this, it's really important to pull out ethnographic research, which is essentially not just asking people about their experiences, but deep hanging out with them. It's a form of collecting data and information and learning by spending time with them on the streets or wherever they are. So here is just some media snippets, again, about the importance of hate crime coming up against unhoused community members. And even though our media is increasingly sharing some of these stories, attacks against unhoused community members motivated by bias or hate are not recognized as hate crimes. Our law does not protect homeless people against attacks like this that are motivated by hatred of them as homeless people. And this is interesting because people say, well, homelessness, it's a changeable characteristic. You can change whether you're homeless or not. So it's not a protected class. But if we look at it, other protected groups, you can also change those things. So for example, religion. People switch religions sometimes, they change their connections, depth of spirituality. People's experiences of disability also change, right? You might go from being quite disabled at one moment to much healthier. And so this kind of excuse of not including homelessness is very curious and we argue really problematic. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to pull from this massive data set. We have a huge study, which we refer to as the Canadian Crime and Homelessness Study. We have been very fortunate that over the past several years, we have interviewed 550 unhoused community members across 9 Canadian cities and the 4 provinces that you see. This study is ongoing and it's broad and it's massive, and we have been really fortunate to learn several things. Just to give you a bit more understanding of the method, so to our knowledge, this is the largest criminological study on homelessness in Canadian history. And what we do really differently is we conduct street-based fieldwork. That means that we meet people on the streets wherever they are. That's where we meet them, that's where we find them, that's when we tell them who we are, and we invite them to participate in the study. If they agree, of course, they're included, and if they don't agree, that's totally fine. And we do this as compared to going through community organizations for 2 key reasons. The first reason is what we found is that many of our most marginalized individuals, especially those who are unhoused, often do not access community resources because they either don't trust them, or they've had bad experiences, or they're banned. And so if you go through community resources, often you're missing the most marginalized stories. And these are really important. And the second thing is, if you end up interviewing individuals in, say, a soup kitchen office or in a shelter office, you're sitting there and yes, you can have a conversation, but you're not privy to all the things that are happening in real time that you can ask about. You're not able to see other things that will really jog your mind on other things that might be important to ask about. So this allows us to stay tuned to individuals. As I mentioned, we've interviewed over 550 individuals, and at the same time, we've spent a lot of hours deep hanging out. So we spend time in encampments, behind alleys, in staircases, outside trap houses or crack dens, whatever you want to call them. And this allows us to also garner information while being in the space. Each participant was compensated $30 cash for their time and knowledge, just as a token of understanding that they bring critical knowledge to us. For this talk, just going to focus on Lethbridge, Treaty 7, where we spoke and spent time with 50 individuals experiencing homelessness. The participants were just about evenly split by gender. We did have some trans folks participate as well. And a huge proportion of our participants were Indigenous, and that's a huge reflection of the ongoing colonial violence that we're seeing in Lethbridge, and also really mimics the proportion that official homeless statistics in Lethbridge show. We spent hundreds of hours observing participants as well and spending time with them, and most of our time we spent in public park, near the town library, and in alleyways. Some quick insights on Lethbridge, just in case you're unfamiliar. So Lethbridge is a pretty cool place. It's about, I want to say 2 to 3 hours south of Calgary. It was quite a long drive here from Edmonton. Has a population of about 100,000. The estimates are that there's about 450 people without homes there right now. Again, because it's very difficult to count these individuals, we anticipate it is quite a bit higher. Lethbridge has been really in the media lately in terms of their massive concerns about drug use, homelessness, social disorder. And this was especially true when they shut down their safe consumption site, which was the busiest safe consumption site in all of North America, despite being located in this relatively small city. So a lot of controversy and chaos in the community there. People also said that Lethbridge, they experienced it as being quite racist, specifically in terms of anti-Indigenous biases. At the same time, there is stark overrepresentation in poverty and homelessness among Indigenous peoples in Canada, of course, reflecting intergenerational trauma and colonial violence. Okay, so what we did when we went into the community, we never thought we'd be asking or talking to people about anti-homeless hate crimes. Hate crime wasn't even part of the questions we were asking about. We would go in about asking all kinds of things. And one of the questions was always, how safe do you feel? And this is where hate crimes emerged, okay? When we asked people, do you feel safe? Why or why not? One thing they all told us about was the infamous white guerrillas group. Now, what are the white guerrillas? Well, our participants described them in several ways. So Carly, as you see, called them a white hate group. Sally said they're a group of people put together that hate natives, and that's it. They hate on the natives and they beat them up while they're alone. Lily, further on the slide, you see, says that their motives are very similar to what the KKK was for Black people, but this is for Indigenous people. Now, notably, participants themselves were not really sure whether this group of white guerrillas that drive around the city in big trucks and beat up vulnerable, homeless Indigenous people or other homeless people, whether they were motivated by hatred against Indigenous people or whether they were motivated by hatred against homeless people. Because there were accounts saying that sometimes the white guerrillas would beat up people who were not Indigenous, but the key thing was that they were homeless. Although, of course, Indigenous people comprise the majority of victims. So it's really unclear what the white guerrillas' motivations are. Now, what made it even more problematic for our participants, why they felt so unsafe, is that the white guerrillas, apart from being this group of usually men that drive around trying to find Indigenous people to attack, they say that their violence is coordinated and highly organized. So it's not just one or two people looking for individuals that they can beat up to get a kick out of it or because, they're sick and filled with hatred. Participants said that this was a coordinated group. So Zana on the slide here talked to us about, these guys, they communicate with each other. So if they spot natives over here, they're going to call or they're text, we're over here, and boom, the other cars go over there. They start harassing people. They start driving by yelling racist slurs. So again, right, we're seeing this coordinated effort. Carly gave us more context. She says, they come into town, they beat the shit out of people. They take girls in their vehicles and, they lure them into that truck and take off out of town. They beat the shit out of them and they rape them. Now, this is particularly important and is very troubling because, of course, all violence is horrific. However, being attacked by one person, the impact that that has and the fear that that might impose is quite different than being attacked by multiple people, especially when there's multiple trucks driving around trying to find people to harm in this rather small city. So let's look at some of these impacts. Now, participants told us several of them had themselves been victimized by the white guerrillas. They said that often this was in the form of verbal harassment. So the white guerrillas or even other community members in Lethbridge driving by saying racist things to them, being really offensive. But they also said that sometimes this translated into physical violence. One of the most common things that we saw from the white guerrillas, but also just from regular Lethbridge residents, is that they would throw things at unhoused people in Lethbridge because they really did not like the homeless problem in that community. Now, sometimes unhoused community members were especially vulnerable to these things. So I'm going to come back to the slide, but I want to give you a sense of one of the spaces in the city where they were most at risk. So if you haven't been to Lethbridge, I encourage you to go check it out, not for this reason, but for other reasons. So if you look at the bottom left of your screen, you see this green space called Galt Gardens. This is a public park in downtown Lethbridge. It's where many unhoused community members spend a lot of time. And on the other side of this highway, what you're seeing there, right? It's kind of train tracks, everything like that, is basically the shelter. And that's usually where they go to access services, things like that. And at the same time, too, there was basically an injection reversal site put up there as well. So they often have to take this long bridge there on Stafford Drive to get through that. Let me show you a picture so it makes more sense. Here you go. So it's this long, narrow bridge. And this is where participants were often had things thrown at them or things yelled at them. When they were on this bridge, the sidewalks are very narrow and they can't escape. So again, just showing the importance of these kind of localized nuances. Now, in addition to throwing things, they were also often assaulted. So here we have Phil talking about what has happened to him by this group, right? His own experiences. He says, I've got metal all over my face, metal on my head. I was hit on my head, hit my arm. He shows us, right? All of his scars. He's like, everything here, all of these injuries, that's from the white guerrillas. Now, as if that's not traumatic and horrifying enough, we also heard many accounts of sexual violence, specifically against Indigenous women. So let's look at those risks being gendered, okay? So people told us that Indigenous women were particularly likely to be harmed by the white guerrillas. The white guerrillas, they said, would attack just about any homeless person, especially those who might have been drunk or who might have been high, people who weren't really able to resist them very well, right? If they were incapacitated. But Indigenous women were particularly at risk. And especially when they were alone, like Olive says here on the screen, Zana said, I think they attack Indigenous women more because they're probably much more defenseless than the men. And some individuals said that they particularly enjoyed this very sexualized, gendered harassment. So Wendy here describes what happened. In one instance, she says, they pulled up in 3 big trucks. They surrounded me. They said, where are you going? Where do you think you're going? I kept trying to go around and they got me from behind and I got hit with a baseball bat. So women in particular are especially vulnerable in this case, which is consistent with the criminological research that shows that Indigenous women are especially prone to being harmed, victims of violence, homicide, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one thing that's really difficult in this regard specifically is that this gendered risk also often accumulated in gendered violence and significant violence, and including in rape in that regard. So people talked about, walking by Walmart and they were walking with their friends and they hear whistles and they realize it's the white guerrillas running at them. And they had to run and duck into stores and hide out and wait out. And that in particular, this was especially important for women who had to wait to be with other people or with men in order to walk through the city and to feel safer in that guard. So here I just want to tell you a little bit more of Wendy's story. So when they pulled up and they hit her with this baseball bat, she says she got almost knocked out. I'm going to read directly here. She says, I just started running. They were laughing, and then they started hitting me on my knees. They kept doing it until they knocked me out. When I came to, I was tied up on a bed with like plastic, making sure that there's no blood. 3 of them raped me, and the rest were laughing. Now, Wendy managed to escape. This is what she said. She says, I ran. I was naked. I ran all the way back to the shelter, to my camp. Now, after barely surviving such a barbaric attack, this wasn't enough of Wendy's victimization, because she says that when she tried to go to the shelter to take a shower after this brutal, horrific sexual assault, shelter staff did not believe her and they did not let her in, which meant she had to bathe in the frozen, icy river at the time. So again, this shows us it's not enough to just look at hate crime victimization, but to look at how people's resources, class, or lack thereof, right? Lack of money, lack of access to resources, further amplifies the harm that they face when they are victimized. Now, I know that was very difficult, so bear with me here. In addition to the participants who spoke about their own violent victimization, just about everybody else we spoke to said that they had heard of other people getting harmed. So what we know is that when it comes to hate crime, you don't have to be harmed yourself to be negatively affected by it. People refer to hate crimes as message crimes because the purpose is not just to harm one person, but it's to send a message to the broader community that they are at risk, right? So hate crimes against other people in your community, whatever that is, whether it's your racial or ethnic community, your cultural community, your sexual orientation community, your gender community, whatever it is, can impact you. And so the impact of this vicarious victimization, which is what we refer to when other people get harmed, is significant. And what we heard is that this was pretty frequent. So here we have Wendy again, right? So Wendy was the woman just endured this brutal sexual assault. And then she mentioned what happened to her aunt. She says the white guerrillas threw her off the bridge. They thought they killed her. Thankfully, the aunt survived in this instance, but Wendy was again scared that they're going to do it to her again. So these stories and narratives and fears of this white guerrillas group driving around harming people is enough to cause harm and damage to other people in the community. Now, one thing that's very important here, right? Unhoused community members, Indigenous community members are not just victims. They enact all kinds of strategies and efforts to try to stay safe, to try to survive and make it through, even in such difficult circumstances. So we identified different strategies that people on the streets employed in Lethbridge to try to prevent the white guerrillas from harming them. First thing you see here is safety in numbers. This was a big thing. You don't walk around by yourself, especially at night. And this was especially true for women. So try to stay with other people. The second thing is restricting movement. So there were some parts of the city that they considered much more dangerous than others. And so they would try to avoid those. They would also just try to stay hidden, sleeping behind bushes, all of these things. Now, as you can imagine, right, the need to have to walk with people and not being able to access certain parts of the community, or having to hide, or having to wait for others to come get you so they can, take you to McDonald's so that you can get a meal for the day. This is further a form of victimization, right? Further restricts community members' ability to live their lives and to maybe improve their situations because they can't just navigate the area freely. And they don't have homes that they can go to truly rest. They are never really safe in this community. So participants did their best to try to avoid it. That being said, they also realized that given their dire situation, the fact they don't have homes, the fact they have no money, some said, you just have to hope, you just have to have luck, and you have to pray. So Colby here says, there's no strategies. You just have to have hope and good luck, prayer. So they knew that even when they tried their best, there was still a good chance that they could be harmed, which is, of course, a devastating thing to think about and to carry with you every day. Now, some of you might be thinking, just like we were, what about the police, right? Lethbridge has a police service. Aren't they doing anything about it? Well, participants told us that when they did go to the police to report it, the police either did not believe them or dismissed it and did not pursue investigating the situation. Now, what's further interesting is that many participants told us they believe that part of the reason the police have not responded to this is because the white guerrillas are actually the children of local police officers. Now, we heard this many, many times, and of course, we don't have evidence of this, and we're not alleging this, but this is the belief. And this belief that these are the cops' kids, as participants said, right, further prevented them from trying to access justice through the police in this regard. So here, Sherry says, the cops' kids are in some kind of gang. This is who we call the white guerrillas. And they're supposed to be the cops' kids. How could we run to them when it's their kids, you know? They're just going to brush us off because those are their kids. Now, interestingly, we did actually share our data and our research with the Lethbridge Police, and I'm happy to speak about their responses during Q&A. Let's go next. What is very interesting, one of my last final points, is that we were not able to confirm that the white guerrillas exist as a group. What do I mean by that? We believe participants' accounts. We know they were victimized, right? We recognize their traumas, but we cannot identify that there is one collective group with this name that is going around harming Indigenous people. It is possible that it's multiple groups of people that come into town or youth or something like that that do this. The ultimate thing is, it doesn't matter because the consequence is the same. So it doesn't really matter if it is a super organized group called the white guerrillas, but the consequences are the same for people on the streets. We were not able to find any formal sources describing the white guerrillas, but we did find from several years ago a Facebook post from a local radio station asking people if they had heard about this infamous white guerrillas gang. There was over 100 comments. Some said, yes, I have, they victimized me. Some said they victimized my family. Others said, oh no, it's just urban legend. Once our paper came out, this radio station deleted this post. So it's very interesting situation in that regard. Now, what are the implications of this, right? First and foremost, what we know and our data really show is anti-homeless violence is a real problem. And by all metrics, how it's experienced and the harm it caused, it constitutes a hate crime, and it should be protected under hate crime legislation. That being said, when we are looking at hate crimes, victimization, and consequences, we can't just look at one aspect. We can't just look at like homelessness or indigeneity or gender. We need to take an intersectional approach, right? Looking at how all of these characteristics together work to make some people more vulnerable to hate crime than others. So it's not just being a homeless person in Lethbridge, it's being homeless, Indigenous, and a woman that can make you particularly likely to experience hate crime. And it might subject you to particular forms of hate crime like sexual violence. And it might mean then that when you try to take a bath after, the shelter system harms you even more. And so this really leads to the thought and the idea that mainstream institutions, even helping institutions like shelters, like soup kitchens, et cetera, they can either enable or worsen victims' vulnerability to these things. And so as a result of this, we've come up with this new concept that we call the cumulative risk of hate crime victimization. Again, looking at how all these different layers, right? Class, gender, location, all of these things act together to increase people's susceptibility to hate crime and the consequences of when they're victimized. So what should we do? First, unhoused people need to be considered official, legally protected grounds as a class for for hate crime. The second thing is our current approaches to hate crime are largely either education or terrorist responses. As our data show through Lethbridge, none of these are really going to work. What we need to do is really prioritize and emphasize social services and Indigenous-led initiatives that can assist individuals from protecting them against hate crime, and or potentially using legal tools, if that's what community members desire, to meaningfully pursue this. We also know we need more place-based research, something that is really deeply immersed in the community. So in Lethbridge, right, now seeing the lay of the land, now seeing the bridge, you can really appreciate the totality of the victimization and the vulnerability that unhoused community members there experience. So we need more on-the-ground research from these areas, not just high-level surveys. And the last thing is, if we incorporate this cumulative risk of hate crime victimization, right, what are all of the factors at play here, then we can better address people's vulnerability to hate crime through this intersectional lens. What's one quick note? So again, we've been to multiple cities. We've just talked about one. In other cities and communities that we've been to, we have heard accounts of people saying, you know, I was harassed, or even vigilante violence. So we heard this quite a bit in Winnipeg, Kenora, and Kelowna. And it's interesting because it's unclear to us, and we're hoping to look at this going forward. Is there a difference between hate crime, right, where you're attacked because somebody hates some part about you, and anti-homeless vigilantism, where you are being punished, right, for the harms that you are causing to that community? And so is there a difference here? Does it matter? Is this just definitional difference, and are the consequences the same? So that's kind of where we're hoping to go with this work going forward. And thank you. So here's a picture of our paper that recently came out. All of my colleagues' names and emails are on the screen. And yeah, if there's time for questions, I know we're a bit late, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much for doing such an awesome presentation. I hope you can send your slides and your link to me again.
Of course.
I'd like to invite my students and attendees to please pose a question. I personally really loved on the ground, real listening to stories rather than statistical numbers. Real stories, real people inside, real social information. And I think your work is really transformational because it will have an impact on the lives of people, real people. And that's extremely important. We can do something. At least you're raising awareness about the reality, of the reality, I think. So the floor is open now, and I invite my students and all attendees to pose questions.